Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the January 2025 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of Kapital, Volume 1, Chapter 8, Constant Capital and Variable Capital, by Karl Marx from 1867. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee at patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. If you choose to contribute via Patreon, please use the website or the Android app to sign up, as the Apple iOS app will charge you extra. There are links to Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee in the video description. So Chapter 8 is the second chapter in Part 3, the production of absolute surplus value. This topic deals with extending the workday in order to get more surplus value out of workers. But mostly in this chapter, we're not going to discuss that particular topic. Rather, just a piece that is going to combine with other pieces to add up to a fuller discussion of that topic. What we're going to do in this chapter is continue the discussion from Chapter 7 of how bits of value get transferred from the breakdown of the means of production into the product that is being produced. So we're going to talk about the twofold character of labor. Labor has both a general character, that is, we can consider it in the abstract as a portion of the total labor of society, regardless of the particular form that it takes. And then also we can consider it in the particular form that it takes, whether it is digging or forging or whatever. And it's important to make this distinction because as general abstract labor, it adds value, and as whatever specific kind of labor it is, it preserves and transfers value. So we're going to talk about that at some length. And then towards the end of the chapter, this is going to wrap up with Marx introducing the terms constant capital and variable capital. Constant capital refers to the material components which go into the production process and then become embodied in the product. And this relates to what we were talking about before, because none of this can create new value. At best, it can just be preserved and transferred over into the new product. Variable capital, on the other hand, is wages, the price of the labor power, which is the source of the new value which is added in the production process. And to give you a preview quote, Marx says about this, it both reproduces the equivalent of its own value and also produces an excess, a surplus value, which may itself vary, may be more or less according to circumstances. This part of capital is continually being transformed from a constant into a variable magnitude. I therefore call it the variable part of capital, or shortly, variable capital. Marx then underscores that from one point of view, the point of view of the labor process, which may or may not occur in capitalism, these present themselves respectively as the objective and subjective factors, or in other words, means of production and labor power. But from the point of view of the capitalist and the process of creating surplus value, which is the concern of the capitalist, they are constant and variable capital. So Marx says that there's always a ratio of these two things. They're always present, but the relative amount of one to the other may vary. Marx calls that the organic composition of capital, but we're not going to get into that term yet. What we're mainly concerned with at this point is, as Marx says, unlike the constant capital, which embodies some amount of value, but which can never impart more value than it originally embodies, the labor power can create value, therefore reproducing itself and then creating a surplus. So as the chapters in this part all deal with absolute surplus value, or the extension of the working day by the capitalist to increase the absolute surplus value, this is an important piece to understand. So let's begin. Chapter 8, Constant Capital and Variable Capital. The various factors of the labor process play different parts in forming the value of the product. The laborer adds fresh value to the subject of their labor by expending upon it a given amount of additional labor, no matter what the specific character and utility of that labor may be. On the other hand, the values of the means of production used up in the process are preserved and present themselves afresh as constituent parts of the value of the product. The values of the cotton and the spindle, for instance, reappear again in the value of the yarn. The value of the means of production is therefore preserved by being transferred to the product. This transfer takes place during the conversion of those means into a product, or in other words, during the labor process. It is brought about by labor, but how? The laborer does not perform two operations at once, one in order to add value to the cotton, the other in order to preserve the value of the means of production, or what amounts to the same thing, to transfer to the yarn, to the product, the value of the cotton on which they work, and part of the value of the spindle with which they work. But by the very act of adding new value, they preserved their former values. Since, however, the addition of new value to the subject of their labor and the preservation of its former value are two entirely distinct results, produced simultaneously by the laborer during one operation, it is plain that this twofold nature of the result can be explained only by the twofold nature of their labor. At one and the same time, it must in one character create value, and in another character preserve or transfer value. Now, in what manner does every laborer add new labor and consequently new value? Evidently, only by laboring productively in a particular way. The spinner by spinning, the weaver by weaving, the smith by forging. But, while thus incorporating labor generally, that is, value, it is by the particular form alone of the labor, by the spinning, the weaving, and the forging respectively, that the means of production, the cotton and spindle, the yarn and loom, the iron and anvil become constituent elements of the product, of a new use value. Quoting an essay on the political economy of nations, labor gives a new creation for one extinguished, unquote. Each use value disappears, but only to reappear under a new form in a new use value. Now, we saw when we were considering the process of creating value that if a use value be effectively consumed in the production of a new use value, the quantity of labor expended in the production of the consumed article forms a portion of the quantity of labor necessary to produce the new use value. This portion is therefore labor transferred from the means of production to the new product. Hence, the laborer preserves the values of the consumed means of production, or transfers them as portions of its value to the product, not by virtue of their additional labor, abstractly considered, but by virtue of the particular useful character of that labor, by virtue of its special productive form. Insofar, then, as labor is such specific productive activity, insofar as it is spinning, weaving, or forging, it raises by mere contact the means of production from the dead, makes them living factors of the labor process, and combines with them to form the new products. If the special productive labor of the worker were not spinning, they could not convert the cotton into yarn, and therefore could not transfer the values of the cotton and spindle to the yarn. Suppose the same worker were to change their occupation to that of a joiner. They would still, by a day's labor, add value to the material they work upon. Consequently, we see first that the addition of new value takes place not by virtue of their labor being spinning in particular, or joinering in particular, but because it is labor in the abstract, a portion of the total labor of society. And we see next that the value added is of a given definite amount, not because their labor has a special utility, but because it is exerted for a definite time. On the one hand, then, it is by virtue of its general character, as being expenditure of human labor power in the abstract, that spinning adds new value to the values of the cotton and the spindle, and on the other hand, it is by virtue of its special character, as being a concrete, useful process, that the same labor of spinning both transfers the values of the means of production to the product and preserves them in the product. Hence, at one and the same time, there is produced a twofold result. By the simple addition of a certain quantity of labor, new value is added, and by the quality of this added labor, the original values of the means of production are preserved in the product. This twofold effect, addition of new value and preservation of existing value, resulting from the twofold character of labor, may be traced in various phenomena. Let us assume that some invention enables the spinner to spin as much cotton in 6 hours as they were able to spin before in 36 hours. Their labor is now 6 times as effective as it was for the purposes of useful production. The product of 6 hours' work has increased 6-fold, from 6 pounds to 36 pounds. But now the 36 pounds of cotton absorb only the same amount of labor as formerly did the 6 pounds. 1/6 as much new labor is absorbed by each pound of cotton, and consequently the value added by the labor to each pound is only 1/6 of what it formerly was. On the other hand, in the product, in the 36 pounds of yarn, the value transferred from the cotton is 6 times as great as before. By the 6 hours spinning, the value of the raw material preserved and transferred to the product is 6 times as great as before, although the new value added by the labor of the spinner to each pound of the very same raw material is 1/6 what it was formerly. This shows that the two properties of labor, by virtue of which it is enabled in one case to preserve value, and in the other to create value, are essentially different. On the one hand, the longer the time necessary to spin a given weight of cotton into yarn, the greater is the new value added to the material. On the other hand, the greater the weight of the cotton spun in a given time, the greater is the value preserved, by being transferred from it to the product. Let us now assume that the productiveness of the spinner's labor, instead of varying, remains constant, that they therefore require the same time as they formerly did, to convert 1 pound of cotton into yarn, but that the exchange value of the cotton varies, either by rising to 6 times its former value or falling to 1/6 of that value. In both these cases, the spinner puts the same quantity of labor into a pound of cotton, and therefore adds as much value as they did before the change in the value. They also produce a given weight of yarn in the same time as they did before. Nevertheless, the value that they transfer from the cotton to the yarn is either 1/6 of what it was before the variation, or as the case may be, 6 times as much as before. The same result occurs when the value of the instruments of labor rises or falls, while their useful efficacy in the process remains unaltered. Again, if the technical conditions of the spinning process remain unchanged, and no change of value takes place in the means of production, the spinner continues to consume in equal working times equal quantities of raw material, and equal quantities of machinery of unvarying value. The value that they preserve in the product is directly proportional to the new value that they add to the product. In 2 weeks, they incorporate twice as much labor, and therefore twice as much value, as in 1 week. And during the same time, they consume twice as much material, and wear out twice as much machinery, of double the value in each case. They therefore preserve, in the product of 2 weeks, twice as much value as in the product of 1 week. So long as the conditions of production remain the same, the more value the laborer adds by fresh labor, the more value they transfer and preserve. But they do so merely because this addition of new value takes place under conditions that have not varied and are independent of their own labor. Of course, it may be said in one sense that the laborer preserves old value always in proportion to the quantity of new value that they add. Whether the value of cotton rise from 1 shilling to 2 shillings, or fall to 6 pence, the worker invariably preserves in the product of 1 hour only 1/2 as much value as they preserve in 2 hours. In like manner, if the productiveness of their own labor varies by rising or falling, they will in 1 hour spin either more or less cotton as the case may be, than they did before, and will consequently preserve in the product of 1 hour more or less value of cotton. But all the same, they will preserve by 2 hours' labor twice as much value as they will by 1. Value exists only in articles of utility, in objects. We leave out of consideration its purely symbolical representation by tokens. Humans themselves, viewed as the impersonation of labor power, are natural objects, things, although living conscious things, and labor is the manifestation of this power residing in us. If, therefore, an article loses its utility, it also loses its value. The reason why means of production do not lose their value, at the same time that they lose their use value, is this. They lose in the labor process the original form of their use value, only to assume in the product the form of a new use value. But however important it may be to value, that it should have some object of utility to embody itself in, yet it is a matter of complete indifference what particular object serves this purpose. This we saw when treating of the metamorphosis of commodities. Hence it follows that in the labor process, the means of production transfer their value to the product only so far as along with their use value they lose also their exchange value. They give up to the product that value alone which they themselves lose as means of production. But in this respect, the material factors of the labor process do not all behave alike. The coal burnt under the boiler vanishes without leaving a trace. So too the tallow with which the axles of wheels are greased. Dyestuffs and other auxiliary substances also vanish but reappear as properties of the product. Raw material forms the substance of the product, but only after it has changed its form. Hence, raw material and auxiliary substances lose the characteristic form with which they're clothed on entering the labor process. It is otherwise with the instruments of labor. Tools, machines, workshops, and vessels are of use in the labor process only so long as they retain their original shape, and are ready each morning to renew the process with their shape unchanged. And just as during their lifetime, that is to say, during the continued labor process in which they serve, they retain their shape independent of the product, so too they do after their death. The corpses of machines, tools, workshops, etc. are always separate and distinct from the product they help to turn out. If we now consider the case of any instrument of labor during the whole period of its service, from the day of its entry into the workshop till the day of its banishment into the lumber room, we find that during this period its use value has been completely consumed, and therefore its exchange value completely transferred to the product. For instance, if a spinning machine lasts for 10 years, it is plain that during that working period, its total value is gradually transferred to the product of the 10 years. The lifetime of an instrument of labor, therefore, is spent in the repetition of a greater or less number of similar operations. Its life may be compared with that of a human being. Every day brings a person 24 hours nearer to their grave, but how many days they have still to travel on that road, no one can tell accurately by merely looking at them. This difficulty, however, does not prevent life insurance offices from drawing, by means of the theory of averages, very accurate, and at the same time very profitable conclusions. So it is with the instruments of labor. It is known by experience how long on the average a machine of a particular kind will last. Suppose its use value in the labor process to last only 6 days. Then, on the average, it loses each day 1/6 of its use value, and therefore parts with 1/6 of its value to the daily product. The wear and tear of all instruments, their daily loss of use value, and the corresponding quantity of value they part with to the product are accordingly calculated upon this basis. It is thus strikingly clear that means of production never transfer more value to the product than they themselves lose during the labor process by the destruction of their own use value. If such an instrument has no value to lose, if, in other words, it is not the product of human labor, it transfers no value to the product. It helps to create use value without contributing to the formation of exchange value. In this class are included all means of production supplied by nature without human assistance, such as land, wind, water, metals in situ, and timber in virgin forests. Yet another interesting phenomenon here presents itself. Suppose a machine to be worth £1,000 and to wear out in 1,000 days. Then, 1,000th part of the value of the machine is daily transferred to the day's product. At the same time, though with diminishing vitality, the machine as a whole continues to take part in the labor process. Thus it appears that one factor of the labor process, a means of production, continually enters as a whole into that process, while it enters into the process of the formation of value by fractions only. The difference between the two processes is here reflected in their material factors, by the same instrument of production taking part as a whole in the labor process, while at the same time as an element in the formation of value, it enters only by fractions. Footnote here, the subject of repairs of the implements of labor does not concern us here. A machine that is undergoing repair no longer plays the part of an instrument, but that of a subject of labor. Work is no longer done with it, but upon it. It is quite permissible for our purpose to assume that the labor expended on the repairs of instruments is included in the labor necessary for their original production. But in the text we deal with that wear and tear which no doctor can cure, and which little by little brings about death, with, quote, that kind of wear which cannot be repaired from time to time, and which, in the case of a knife, would ultimately reduce it to a state in which the cutler would say of it, it is not worth a new blade, unquote. We have shown in the text that a machine takes part in every labor process as an integral machine, but that into the simultaneous process of creating value it enters only bit by bit. How great then is the confusion of ideas exhibited in the following extract, quoted from Observations on Certain Verbal Disputes in Political Economy, particularly relating to value. Mr. Ricardo says a portion of the labor of the engineer in making stocking machines is contained, for example, in the value of a pair of stockings, yet the total labor that produced each single pair of stockings includes the whole labor of the engineer, not a portion. For one machine makes many pairs, and none of those pairs could have been done without any part of the machine, unquote. The author, an uncommonly self-satisfied wiseacre, is right in his confusion and therefore in his contention to this extent only, that neither Ricardo nor any other economist before or since him has accurately distinguished the two aspects of labor, and still less therefore the part played by it under each of these aspects in the formation of value. Back to the main text. On the other hand, a means of production may take part as a whole in the formation of value, while into the labor process it enters only bit by bit. Suppose that in spinning cotton, the waste for every 115 pounds used amounts to 15 pounds, which is converted not into yarn, but into, quote, devil's dust. Now, although this 15 pounds of cotton never becomes a constituent element of the yarn, yet assuming this amount of waste to be normal and inevitable under average conditions of spinning, its value is just as surely transferred to the value of the yarn as is the value of the 100 pounds that form the substance of the yarn. The use value of 15 pounds of cotton must vanish into dust before 100 pounds of yarn can be made. The destruction of this cotton is therefore a necessary condition in the production of the yarn. And because it is a necessary condition and for no other reason, the value of that cotton is transferred to the product. The same holds good for every kind of refuse resulting from a labor process, so far at least as such refuse cannot be further employed as a means in the production of new and independent use values. Such an employment of refuse may be seen in the large machine works at Manchester, where mountains of iron turnings are carted away to the foundry in the evening, in order the next morning to reappear in the workshops as solid masses of iron. We have seen that the means of production transfer value to the new product so far only as during the labor process they lose value in the shape of their old use value. The maximum loss of value that they can suffer in the process is plainly limited by the amount of the original value with which they came into the process, or in other words, by the labor time necessary for their production. Therefore, the means of production can never add more value to the product than they themselves possess, independently of the process in which they assist. However useful a given kind of raw material, or a machine, or other means of production may be, though it may cost £150 or say 500 days' labor, yet it cannot, under any circumstances, add to the value of the product more than £150. Its value is determined not by the labor process into which it enters as a means of production, but by that out of which it has issued as a product. In the labor process, it only serves as a mere use value, a thing with useful properties, and could not, therefore, transfer any value to the product unless it possessed such value previously. Comment: because why? What is the only commodity which can create value? Human labor. Footnote here. From this we may judge the absurdity of J.B. Say, who pretends to account for surplus value, interest, profit, rent, by the so-called productive services which the means of production, soil, instruments, and raw material render in the labor process by means of their use values. Mr. William Rosher, who seldom loses an occasion of registering in black and white ingenious apologetic fancies, records the following specimen. Quote, J.B. Say very truly remarks, the value produced by an oil mill, after deduction of all costs, is something new, something quite different from the labor by which the oil mill itself was erected. Unquote. Very true, Mr. Professor. The oil produced by the oil mill is indeed something very different from the labor expended in constructing the mill. By value, Mr. Rosher understands such stuff as oil, because oil has value, notwithstanding that nature produces petroleum, though relatively in small quantities, a fact to which he seems to refer in his further observation, quote, nature, produces scarcely any exchange value, unquote. Mr. Rosher's nature and the exchange value it produces are rather like the foolish virgin who admitted indeed that she had had a child, but, quote, it was such a little one. This serious savant, in continuation, remarks, quote, Ricardo's school is in the habit of including capital as accumulated labor under the head of labor. This is unskillful work, because indeed the owner of capital, after all, does something more than the merely creating and preserving of the same, namely, the abstention from the enjoyment of it, for which they demand, e.g., interest, unquote. How very skillful is this anatomico-physiological method of political economy, which, indeed, converts a mere desire, after all, into a source of value. Back to the main text. While productive labor is changing the means of production into constituent elements of a new product, their value undergoes a metempsychosis. It deserts the consumed body to occupy the newly created one. But this transmigration takes place, as it were, behind the back of the laborer. They are unable to add new labor, to create new value, without at the same time preserving old values, and this because the labor they add must be of a specific useful kind, and they cannot do work of a useful kind without employing products as the means of production of a new product, and thereby transferring their value to the new product. The property, therefore, which labor power in action, living labor, possesses of preserving value, at the same time that it adds it, is a gift of nature which costs the laborer nothing, but which is very advantageous to the capitalist inasmuch as it preserves the existing value of their capital. Quoting Edmund Burke, of all the instruments of the farmer's trade, the labor of man is that on which he is most to rely for the repayment of his capital. The other two, the working stock of the cattle, and the carts, plows, spades, and so forth, without a given portion of the first, are nothing at all. Unquote. So long as trade is good, the capitalist is too much absorbed in money grubbing to take notice of this gratuitous gift of labor. A violent interruption of the labor process by a crisis makes them sensitively aware of it. Footnote here, in the Times of 26th November 1862, a manufacturer whose mill employed 800 hands and consumed on the average 150 bales of East Indian or 130 bales of American cotton, complains in doleful manner of the standing expenses of his factory when not working. He estimates them at £6,000 a year. Among them are a number of items that don't concern us here, such as rent, rates, and taxes, insurance, salaries of the manager, bookkeeper, engineer, and others. Then he reckons £150 for coal used to heat the mill occasionally and run the engine now and then. Besides this, he includes the wages of the people employed at odd times to keep the machinery in working order. Lastly, he puts down £1,200 for depreciation of machinery because, quote, the weather and the natural principle of decay do not suspend their operations because the steam engine ceases to revolve, unquote. He says emphatically he does not estimate his depreciation at more than the small sum of £1,200 because his machinery is already nearly worn out. Back to the main text. As regards the means of production, what is really consumed is their use value, and the consumption of this use value by labor results in the product. There is no consumption of their value, and it would therefore be inaccurate to say that it is reproduced. Quoting Newman, productive consumption, where the consumption of a commodity is a part of the process of production. In these instances, there is no consumption of value, unquote. It is rather preserved, not by reason of any operation it undergoes itself in the process, but because the article in which it originally exists vanishes, it's true, but vanishes into some other article. Hence, in the value of the product, there is a reappearance of the value of the means of production, but there is, strictly speaking, no reproduction of that value. That which is produced is a new use value in which the old exchange value reappears. Footnote, in an American compendium that has gone through perhaps 20 editions, this passage occurs, quote, it matters not in what form capital reappears, unquote. Then, after a lengthy enumeration of all the possible ingredients of production whose value reappears in the product, the passage concludes thus, quote, the various kinds of food, clothing, and shelter necessary for the existence and comfort of the human being are also changed. They are consumed from time to time, and their value reappears in that new vigor imparted to their body and mind, forming fresh capital to be employed again in the work of production, unquote, quoting from F. Wayland. Without noticing any other oddities, it suffices to observe that what reappears in the fresh vigor is not the bread's price, but its blood-forming substances. What, on the other hand, reappears in the value of that vigor is not the means of subsistence, but their value. The same necessaries of life at half the price would form just as much muscle and bone, just as much vigor, but not vigor of the same value. This confusion of value and vigor, coupled with our author's pharisaical indefiniteness, mark an attempt, futile for all that, to thrash out an explanation of surplus value from a mere reappearance of pre-existing values. Back to the main text. It is otherwise with the subjective factor of the labor process, with labor power in action. While the laborer, by virtue of their labor being of a specialized kind that has a special object, preserves and transfers to the product the value of the means of production, they at the same time, by the mere act of working, create each instant an additional or new value. Suppose the process of production to be stopped just when the worker has produced an equivalent for the value of their own labor power. When, for example, by 6 hours labor, they have added a value of 3 shillings. This value is the surplus of the total value of the product over the portion of its value that is due to the means of production. It is the only original bit of value formed during this process, the only portion of the value of the product created by this process. Of course, we do not forget that this new value only replaces the money advanced by the capitalist in the purchase of the labor power and spent by the laborer on the necessaries of life. With regard to the money spent, the new value is merely a reproduction, but nevertheless it is an actual, and not, as in the case of the value of the means of production, only an apparent reproduction. The substitution of one value for another is here effected by the creation of new value. We know, however, from what has gone before, that the labor process may continue beyond the time necessary to reproduce and incorporate in the product a mere equivalent for the value of the labor power. Instead of the 6 hours that are sufficient for the latter purpose, the process may continue for 12 hours. The action of labor power, therefore, not only reproduces its own value, but produces value over and above it. This surplus value is the difference between the value of the product and the value of the elements consumed in the formation of that product. In other words, of the means of production and the labor power. By our explanation of the different parts played by the various factors of the labor process in the formation of the product's value, we have in fact disclosed the characters of the different functions allotted to the different elements of capital in the process of expanding its own value. The surplus of the total value of the product over the sum of the values of its constituent factors is the surplus of the expended capital over the capital originally advanced. The means of production on the one hand, labor power on the other, are merely the different modes of existence which the value of the original capital assumed when from being money it was transformed into the various factors of the labor process. That part of capital, then, which is represented by the means of production, by the raw material, auxiliary material, and the instruments of labor does not, in the process of production, undergo any quantitative alteration of value. I therefore call it the constant part of capital, or, more shortly, constant capital. On the other hand, that part of capital represented by labor power does, in the process of production, undergo an alteration of value. It both reproduces the equivalent of its own value and also produces an excess, a surplus value, which may itself vary, may be more or less according to circumstances. This part of capital is continually being transformed from a constant into a variable magnitude. I therefore call it the variable part of capital, or shortly, variable capital. The same elements of capital which, from the point of view of the labor process, present themselves respectively as the objective and subjective factors, as means of production and labor power, present themselves, from the point of view of the process of creating surplus value, as constant and variable capital. The definition of constant capital given above by no means excludes the possibility of a change of value in its elements. Suppose the price of cotton to be one day 6 pence a pound, and the next day, in consequence of a failure of the cotton crop, a shilling a pound. Each pound of the cotton bought at 6 pence and worked up after the rise in value transfers to the product a value of 1 shilling, and the cotton already spun before the rise and perhaps circulating in the market as yarn likewise transfers to the product twice its original value. It is plain, however, that these changes of value are independent of the increment or surplus value added to the value of the cotton by the spinning itself. If the old cotton had never been spun, it could, after the rise, be resold at a shilling a pound instead of at 6 pence. Further, the fewer the processes the cotton has gone through, the more certain is this result. We therefore find that speculators make it a rule when such sudden changes in value occur, to speculate in that material on which the least possible quantity of labor has been spent. To speculate, therefore, in yarn rather than in cloth, in cotton itself rather than in yarn. The change of value in the case we have been considering originates not in the process in which the cotton plays the part of a means of production, and in which it therefore functions as constant capital, but in the process in which the cotton itself is produced. The value of a commodity, it's true, is determined by the quantity of labor contained in it, but this quantity is itself limited by social conditions. If the time socially necessary for the production of any commodity alters, and a given weight of cotton represents, after a bad harvest, more labor than after a good one, all previously existing commodities of the same class are affected, because they are, as it were, only individuals of the species, and their value at any given time is measured by the labor socially necessary, i.e. by the labor necessary for their production under the then existing social conditions. Quoting Latrosna, properly speaking, all products of the same kind form a single mass, and their price is determined in general and without regard to particular circumstances. Unquote. As the value of the raw material may change, so too may that of the instruments of labor, of the machinery, etc. employed in the process, and consequently that portion of the value of the product transferred to it from them may also change. If in consequence of a new invention, machinery of a particular kind can be produced by a diminished expenditure of labor, the old machinery becomes depreciated more or less, and consequently transfers so much less value to the product. But here again, the change in value originates outside the process in which the machine is acting as a means of production. Once engaged in this process, the machine cannot transfer more value than it possesses apart from the process. Just as a change in the value of the means of production, even after they have commenced to take a part in the labor process, does not alter their character as constant capital, so too, a change in the proportion of constant to variable capital does not affect the respective functions of these two kinds of capital. The technical conditions of the labor process may be revolutionized to such an extent that where formerly 10 workers using 10 implements of small value worked up a relatively small quantity of raw material, one worker may now, with the aid of one expensive machine, work up 100 times as much raw material. In the latter case, we have an enormous increase in the constant capital that is represented by the total value of the means of production used, and at the same time a great reduction in the variable capital invested in labor power. Such a revolution, however, alters only the quantitative relation between the constant and the variable capital, or the proportions in which the total capital is split up into its constant and variable constituents. It has not in the least degree affected the essential difference between the two.